The Conflict of Mind by O.G. Rose, Part 2, starting with Section 5.
Point 1. Let us explore a situation that could help flesh out the arguments of this paper and highlight why the conflict of mind is a very real and pressing problem. As of January 2017, allegations emerged that President-elect Donald Trump was propped up by the Russian government. Supposedly, Russia could blackmail Trump, and for this reason they helped Trump become president, hoping they could then control America in line with Russian interests. As of the writing of this sentence, Trump's inauguration is in 7 days, the beginning of his term, and the claims against Trump are currently unverified. If the allegations are true, it is rational, morally imperative, and vital for America's safety to keep Trump from becoming president. However, if Trump were kept from becoming president until the reports are verified, this would be a threat to American democracy itself, draw into question the legitimacy of its elections, raise the possibility of future presidents being kept out of office via unfalsifiable, unverified allegations, risk social unrest as Trump supporters potentially riot, and it would also give the CIA extraordinary power over the executive branch that wasn't checked and balanced by branches of government. If Trump were to become president and 10 days later the allegations against him were verified, the very fact someone who Russia aided and could control became president for any amount of time would risk world war, cause there to be increased paranoia and anxiety about all future candidates, bring about questions of if the national election should be redone, for surely a Russian operative's VP shouldn't become president, and also potentially launch a witch hunt against all government officials to assure no one else worked for Russia. In this situation, what should the epistemically responsible and intellectually honest individual do? It should be noted that the failure of our pluralistic and democratic society to acknowledge the difficulty of this question has contributed to our socio-political failures and tensions, as has our failures to be aware of tragedy in general, as discussed in The Tragedy of Us by O.G. Rose and in The Fragility of Goodness by Martha Nussbaum. To elaborate, consciously or unconsciously, it is conceivable that a way in which people seize totalitarian control, manipulate, deceive, confuse, so forth, is by setting up epistemic responsibility in conflict with truth, by creating conflict of mind situations for the public which benefit them and their agenda. On this line of thought, it could be precisely our epistemic responsibility that keeps us from stopping something like the rise of a Third Reich, as it could be precisely our lack of epistemic responsibility. Perhaps it is the responsibility of the oppressed to avoid unnecessary conflicts of mind, to keep people in power from intentionally or unintentionally creating and or using conflicts of mind situations to their advantage and the advantage of their agendas, and from allowing the same of the public, intentionally or unintentionally. If it is a press that is unaware that this is their responsibility, will be conflicted about what exactly constitutes journalistic integrity in a democracy, and furthermore likely create conflict of mind situations unnecessarily, and is perhaps especially likely if the press is increasingly decentralized across the internet and millions of reporters who don't agree on their role. If I decide not to believe Trump is being used by Russia until the reports are verified, and the reports are indeed verified, though I am epistemologically responsible following a more positivistic method, in the eyes of history, I will be one of the many who failed to try Trump from becoming president. I will have failed to stand up against corruption and failed to keep America safe, and yet I will have been epistemically honest. If I decide to believe the reports, stand against Trump becoming president, and the reports are later proven to be false in the eyes of history, I will be an ideologue who tried to hide his partisanship behind claims like better safe than sorry. I will be someone who acted unjustly toward democratic results with which I didn't agree. If I decide to believe the reports, stand against Trump becoming president, and the reports are verified in the eyes of history, I will be someone who appears to always follow the facts and who is always epistemically responsible. And I won't be an ideologue, but rather one of the few who stood up against the impending threat that everyone else was too afraid to see clearly. I will be one of the few who skeptics didn't deter. I will be one of the few who did the right thing. If I decide to not believe the reports and the reports are later disproven, I will have been epistemically responsible and correct about a story that, in the eyes of history, was just another of the thousands of conspiracy theories and fake news stories generated daily. No one knows what will happen over the next 7 days, let alone the next year. History only sees what's history. No one knows what the future holds. No one knows about today what in the future will be obvious. No one knows about today what in the future will seem as if it couldn't have been thought about any other way. We must choose now what we will believe, and we must choose now according to what standard we will believe what we believe, a standard which will orient and define our epistemic responsibility. Failure for our society to acknowledge how future events reach back and ostensibly change what constitutes epistemic responsibility, and failure to acknowledge that we cannot always say for sure what posture actually constitutes epistemic responsibility until a flip moment in the future reduces the chances that our society handles well the great responsibility of democracy. To elaborate further, perhaps I could have avoided this dilemma by defining epistemic responsibility less empirically, but that would mean that I demand less evidence and less verification for believing that Trump was being used by Russia, which would mean that I lowered my intellectual standards, not raised them. If I decide I don't require as much proof or evidence, then I decide I will increase my trust in those who wrote the reports and the reports themselves. But without evidence, in what way is it epistemically responsible to increase my trust in the reports, and how could I be justified to increase my trust? There seems to be no way. Perhaps, though, I should just lower my standard for the amount of evidence I need to believe it is justified to accept the reports, which is different from not demanding any evidence at all, yes? Hence, I can avoid the dilemma by shifting my standard of justification from, say, requiring 10 pieces of convincing evidence to 5. But is the decision to lower my standard of justification a decision I make based on evidence, or is it justified in of itself? Is there evidence I should lower my standard of justification, or just a feeling I should? Is it epistemically responsible to make such a decision based on emotion? If not, why not? If so, why so? And is there an objective standard? And is it epistemically responsible to lower, even raise my standard of justification in order to avoid the dilemma Trump poses, or even to overcome it? Isn't that the height of epistemic irresponsibility? Yes, no. My standard of justification is what defines my epistemic responsibility, and if I change it, I change what for me constitutes epistemic responsibility. Perhaps relative to my former standard, I am epistemically irresponsible, but relative to my new one, I am not, as if I never was epistemically irresponsible. And in fact, if my previous standard was a bad one, my change is in fact an act of epistemic responsibility. And so it cannot even be said for sure that changing standards is epistemically irresponsible. It depends, but not according to an easy-to-determine framework. And who can say for sure that my previous standard of justification wasn't a bad one, or that it was a good one? By what epistemically responsible standard can we say? And how do I determine what should constitute my standard of justification in the first place, or ever, and hence determine my baseline for epistemic responsibility? We are beginning to glimpse a shaking center and approaching the question of justification, but not yet. Point 1-2, to move on. Note that time is an important dilemma in the situation involving the president-elect, and it is important that time is recognized as paramount to the question of epistemic responsibility. Imagine that someone called and told you that a terrorist attack was about to go off near your home. What would be the epistemically responsible thing to do? You don't have evidence that the person is telling the truth, and the person who called is someone you've never heard from before. Two main choices come to mind. Ignore the person. If you do this and the terrorist attack doesn't happen, the call will be a non-event relative to which you seemingly acted epistemically responsible. But if you do this and the attack does happen, the call will be the event for why you seemingly acted epistemically irresponsible. After all, you had evidence a terrorist attack was going to happen, the call itself, and you ignored it. Second option, trust the person. If you do this, the terrorist attack doesn't happen, the fact you considered a random call from a random stranger as worth trusting will be evidence that you were easily manipulated and epistemically irresponsible. But if the attack does happen, you will be epistemically responsible and provide proof that a random call from a random stranger can be valid. So you'll be epistemically responsible and yet wrong, potentially sifting your entire epistemology. Note that the imperative to make a decision is determined by the sense that the bomb will go off soon. That time will soon unveil the truthfulness of the warning, and hence to determine the epistemic irresponsibility or responsibility of listening or ignoring it, though no bomb may go off, keeping you stuck in a feeling of being a moment before a bomb might go off until so many such moments have passed that they begin to lose their emotional edge, which might be precisely when the bomb goes off.
It is precisely this imperative that will perhaps lean you in the direction of running from the house despite the lack of evidence. The cost-benefit analysis weighs heavily in favor of running. Ignoring the warning risks your life, and by ignoring it, you merely avoid a temporary inconvenience. Because the risk of being wrong is death, you have reason to lower your standard of justification or evidence and redefine it as epistemically responsible to believe the stranger on the phone. So you run, only to find out an hour later that it was a prank. You were wrong to lower your standard of justification, even though it was the right thing to do according to your cost-benefit analysis. You were wrong and right. And though you didn't act on a JTB, only a justified belief, someone warned you of an attack and you believed the stranger, in order to know if you were acting on a justified true belief versus a justified belief, you would have had to wait for time to unveil the case of the bomb potentially killing you. But were you actually epistemically responsible or only relatively so? Determining this would require determining at what point of threat is a person actually justified to shift his or her standard of justification for believing a claim. If it is the case that if claim X is true, the world will end, am I justified to believe claim X even if I have only unverified evidence? On the other hand, if it is the case that if claim Y is true, the world won't end, am I justified to believe claim Y when I only have unverified evidence? In other words, doesn't threat level change standards of justification? If so, a dictator could easily exploit and manipulate a public by making all his or her claims ones that if true, the world would end. But surely we should take big threats more seriously than small ones. Yes, but what does it mean to take something more seriously? To hold it up to a lower or higher standard of justification? If lower, by what standard? If higher, by what standard? If it is the case that the world will end if case X is true, should we always act as if case was and or will be true? Is that the only epistemically responsible way to act? It would seem so. It would seem epistemic responsibility would have us be easily manipulated, and in a manner that we could only resist by being epistemically irresponsible. Perhaps this is what all the worst dictators, manipulators, exploiters, and cult leaders know. For more on this problem, as a side note, you should see Death is the Event Horizon of Reason by O.G. Rose. To elaborate, is it epistemically irresponsible to act on a JB versus a JTP, a justified belief versus a justified true belief? If so, in the above example, to be epistemically responsible, you would have to risk dying and or die, at which point you wouldn't know if you were epistemically responsible, so what would it matter? Your cost-benefit analysis would make being epistemically responsible the same as being irresponsible. But to live purely by cost-benefit analysis could quickly make a person OCD. If I believe not touching a doorknob will get my parents killed, it is always rational to do something crazy, even 1,000,000 times, given that I love my parents limitlessly. So shouldn't I think in a manner that combines cost-benefit analysis with epistemic responsibility? Yes, but how? If there's an answer, it's situational. So there's no objective standard? No, and a democracy that fails to realize that is a democracy that will apply countless subjective standards upon its own people, benefiting no one. The question of justification continues to approach. To elaborate more, does a claim over a phone in favor of premise X function as evidence for premise X? Why or why not? In a situation in which we had more time to make a decision, we may say, not if it cannot pass the test of liberal science, and then turn to the work of Jonathan Rauch. However, would Rauch's criteria work when it comes to determining if X is evidence that the painting in front of me is good art? No, but does that mean that there is no such thing as good art? Only subjective opinion. If we say yes, on what ground could we say that Picasso's work is better than the work of my toddler? Evidence is phenomenon toward a case, justifying or disproving it, as discussed in Self-Delusion, the towardness of evidence, and the paradox of judgment. When should X fall under the category of evidence for Y? Why it can is because within us we can carry a case relative to which X can be evidence. But should it be such is a different question. In other words, when we are justified to consider X as evidence for Y versus just consider X as X, this is another question of justification which we will address shortly. Considering the terrorist hypothetical, how do we face the question, what is evidence, in a situation in which a decision must be made now? It would seem that a cost-benefit analysis can change what we are willing to consider evidence, and this hints that what we treat like evidence is relative to the situation, though our textbook definition for evidence may stay the same. What is practically evidence is situational, relative to cost-benefit analysis, and hence so also is epistemic responsibility, even if the actual truth will later unveil that we were epistemically irresponsible. Relative to the moment in which we acted epistemically responsible. Relative to what ultimately turned out to be the case, we may have acted epistemically irresponsible. But our cost-benefit analysis couldn't let us worry about that at the time. So it goes with determining if Trump should be kept out of office. Sometimes it seems that there isn't a good or bad decision, just a decision that we later color in terms of good or bad, seemingly unable to help conceive of it any other way because of the nature of history and time to make what turns out to be the case seem as if it was always obviously the case. There's just us, it seems. To elaborate, do note that the period between when epistemic responsibility and truth are in conflict before verification tend to be quick periods, a few hours, a few days, a few months, but increasingly we are pressured in our democracy to take positions now, in the name of justice, national security, freedom, whatever, thanks mostly to the internet and modern media and how people on social media will know if we fail to take a position, observing our lack of posts, and so on. Also, it's to be noted that it isn't the case that there is a conflict of mind in every situation, but in such situations, perhaps happening less often than others, we can be trained to think of an actual conflict of mind situation not not one at all. When we are used to X, we are likely to see Y as X. This tendency sets us up to be unprepared for when a conflict of the mind situation actually occurs. It is also important to note that if we decide to wait until we get more evidence to decide if the reports about Trump are true, for example, we have taken a position that history and others may judge as epistemically irresponsible or responsible. Likewise, if I were to wait until more evidence to believe the phone call that warned me about a terrorist attack that was about to happen, I would have to practically believe that the terrorist attack wasn't going to happen. Agnosticism isn't escape. In withholding judgment, in being what I'll call intellectually agnostic, though I don't take a position of intellectual belief, I cannot avoid taking a position of practical belief, which is practically identical with an intellectual assent. So be it, but perhaps intellectual agnosticism can still be more epistemically responsible, perhaps, but it will be practically identical with either epistemic responsibility or irresponsibility relative to what turns out to be true, and hence the perhaps greater epistemic morality of intellectual agnosticism will be practically irrelevant. The possibility is salafistic and practically useless for the question of how democracy should function if it is to be epistemically responsible. Lastly, and theoretically, even if there was a time when intellectual agnosticism was more epistemically responsible, there can come a point when continuing to be intellectually agnostic suddenly becomes epistemically irresponsibility, such as when new evidence comes out in favor of the premise that Trump is being blackmailed by Russia, say if Trump were to admit it. At this point, it would be epistemically irresponsible to continue being intellectually agnostic. But couldn't it be the case that Trump was forced to confess something that wasn't true? Indeed, the question arises, at what point is a person not justified to continue being intellectually agnostic? At what point must a maybe shift into a yes or no? The question of justification continues to approach. To elaborate more, to offer additional examples similar to being called and told a terrorist attack was about to happen, moments that could be considered some of the purest existential experiences possible. Imagine the following, that Ben Bernanke walks into your office and tells you that if you don't immediately bail out the banks, another Great Depression will occur. Imagine that a top scientist tells you that we have to lower greenhouse emissions quickly or global warming will destroy the world. And lastly, imagine someone tells you that millions of babies are being slaughtered every year, and every minute we do nothing, another dies. Like particles, we constantly exist in a state of unstable possibilities, and democracies that fail to acknowledge this are democracies that will struggle. We exist in this state because we exist in space-time, and since we are always temporal, epistemic responsibility is always temporal. It is always defined in and provided being as itself within space-time. Thinking is always against time, and time is its background. Thinking is always upon time and over time, and yet we often treat thinking as above time and transcendent of it, when in fact thinking never escapes time. It is always in and shaped by it. It is never utterly autonomous and transcendent. Time portrays thought as epistemically responsible, as correct as rational, as always seemingly correct, and as always seemingly on the right side of history or the wrong. Failure of a democracy to realize the power of time to portray thought is a democracy that will fail to value thought in terms of temporality, and the democracy will likely judge it in terms of the eyes of history, or what time unveils to be true. But we thinkers never exist above time, knowing what time will hold. To judge thought in terms of the eyes of history is to judge it in terms of what we never live in or experience. This is likely to contribute to us approaching thought wrong, and in fact make us nervous and even paranoid to think in an age that requires thinking and philosophical thinking like never before, as argued throughout the works of O.G. Rose. Thinking is a race against time, not only in that thought seeks to think before it fades into death, but also because thought attempts to know what truth lies in the future before time arrives at the moment when it unveils that truth. To think, for example, is to try to know if the reports against Trump will be verified or not before they are verified or not. Time unveils truths, and thinking strives to know what is behind the curtain before the curtain is raised, like a specter trying to figure out how a magic trick works before the magician unveils the secret. But time always has the upper hand, for even when it is slower than thought to determine what X is true, time has the power to seemingly reach back in time and make it as if it was always obviously the case that X was true. And it has the power to make it seem as if all thought against the validity of X was thought that was always epistemically irresponsible, and so on. Time portrays thought, but thought can always impact how time manifests by determining and or influencing in which direction of space-time us thinkers travel. However, when it comes to the question of unveiling truth to us and influencing how the eyes of history fall upon those who question the obvious truth, time always has the upper hand. Time profoundly determines how truth is portrayed, and hence it has power over what we consider epistemically responsible and irresponsible, and for how long and when. Epistemic responsibility isn't a solid doctrine, as appeals to pursuing truth to wherever it may lead imply. Rather, epistemic responsibility exists in a constant state of instability, like a particle that changes upon being observed into a state that suddenly seems as if it was always in. The observation of time changes the reality of epistemic irresponsibility or responsibility. Democracies that fail to realize the power of time are democracies that are likely to struggle. The same goes with the study of epistemology, which for too long has discussed intellectual honesty as if what we are epistemically or responsible toward isn't unstable and isn't relative to space-time like a particle. Section 6. What is the epistemically responsible way to respond to someone who always lies? If we know that everything the person says is false, to investigate every claim the person makes would seem to be epistemically irresponsible. Or would it? Can it ever be epistemically responsible not to investigate a claim? We already know ahead of time what our results will be. We'll find out the person lied. And to find out something we already knew, we had to waste a lot of our time, our mental resources, the time of those who will listen to our findings, and so on. Hence, there's good reason to argue that gathering evidence to confirm the claims are false of someone who knows always lies is epistemically irresponsible. It's arguably epistemically irresponsible to investigate the claims of someone we know always lies. But of course, how do we know someone always lies? How do we decide that? To decide someone always lies is an extraordinary act, freeing us of any epistemic obligation to investigate all the claims the person makes, to gather evidence for the person, and so on. Considering this, the standard must be very high for someone to be justified to claim he or she always lies, and it's fair to wonder how someone would ever be epistemically responsible in making this claim. If someone does in fact always lie, and I fail to determine this, and hence discern what is epistemically irresponsible to investigate all, and hence discern that it is epistemically irresponsible to investigate all of the person's claims, I have ultimately acted epistemically irresponsible, even though relative to me, if I don't know yet that the person always lies, I act seemingly epistemically responsible. Hence, determining if a person always lies is of the utmost importance. But how exactly do I do it? How many times must a person lie before it becomes epistemically irresponsible to not assume that the person will always lie, hence making it epistemically responsible to not investigate every claim the person makes? Must the person lie 9 out of 10 times, or 10 out of 10, or 5 out of 10, 6 out of 10? How many? Am I ever justified to assume the person will always lie, and even though the person in 5 years may suddenly never lie again? So, maybe 5 years from now they get a change of belief. If a person lies 9 out of 10 times, it is perhaps fair to say that I would be rational to assume that the person will always lie, and hence epistemically responsible to not investigate everything the person says. But it doesn't follow that I will always be right, say the one time the person tells the truth. In this situation, due to a reasonable and rational probability assessment, being epistemically responsible can conflict with being right. What is the epistemically responsible way to respond to someone who doesn't lie all the time, but who lies a lot? Or what is the epistemically responsible way to respond to someone who doesn't intentionally lie, but who accidentally and unintentionally spreads false information every now and then? Person one perhaps relays false information 3 out of 10 times, while another relays it 6 out of 10 times. Is it epistemically responsible to assume both are people we can ignore and be epistemically responsible for ignoring? If we determine we are justified to ignore the first person and not the second, by what objective standard do we make this judgment? By what standard do we determine that we should investigate and trust in what someone tells us up to 4 lies, but not after 5? Or by what standard do we decide what we should begin taking claims gradually less seriously? By what standard do we decide that we should begin taking claims gradually less seriously? To elaborate, it can be epistemically responsibility itself that can moralize our susceptibility to manipulation. It can be our very commitment to intellectual honesty that can contribute to the rising up of a dictator or the spreading of a conspiracy theory. A democracy that fails to realize this is a democracy that is more likely to fail than thrive. To elaborate more, we are all at different times someone who tells falsities like truths, but not necessarily because we are lying. I could knowingly or accidentally change or embellish a story I tell about wrecking on my sleigh for the sake of entertaining others, perhaps. I may not remember all the details due to the event being so long ago. I might accidentally mix in a dream with what actually happened, in which case I wouldn't even realize I wasn't relaying something true, and the like. Still, the basic element of a sledding accident would remain consistent and true, and if you believe what I tell you, seeing as there is no other way to investigate and or be epistemically responsible about the story, it is because you take my word for it. You have no outside reason to either believe or disbelieve what I tell you, and in this unique situation, perhaps you are epistemically responsible to believe my consistent macro point, but not the corresponding details. Perhaps you should just let my story wash over you and react to my emotions and enjoy the entertainment, but not think about it further once the story is over. Seeing as in the grand scheme of things, how you decide to believe my story is ultimately inconsequential, the question of epistemic responsibility in this situation isn't a dire one. But while this might be the case between friends, the situation dramatically changes if it's between the NSA and the citizens of the United States of America, for example. What is the epistemically responsible thing to do in a situation in which we don't have reason to either disbelieve or believe what I tell you? If we agree to this, then a leader or dictator can manipulate us by making claims that we have to take his or her word for it. To avoid this, we must agree that epistemic responsibility shifts relative to the level, power, and authority of those making the claim. But if it is epistemically irresponsible to just take the NSA's word for it whenever they tell us something that we have no outside reason to either believe or disbelieve, what would be epistemically responsible for us to do? The same could be asked about the media, the academic community, the corporations, and the like. Surely if we do nothing, we are likely to be controlled and manipulated, but then what must we do? Investigate the NSA? But that's impossible without breaking into the NSA. And there's no guarantee that what's uncovered will be useful. Where should we begin looking? And when should we stop searching? It seems that to avoid manipulation, we should do something that we cannot exactly determine. Furthermore, it seems that in order to avoid being controlled, we must take the Pritchard risk, but that possibility is almost too much to bear, as we will discuss. If Americans don't have enough evidence to either believe or disbelieve the claim that the Kremlin actively conspired to arrange for Trump's election, the consequences of antagonizing a nuclear-armed power with false claims carries with it consequences different from, but just as dire, as allowing foreign intervention into our election without repercussions. Considering these options, what is the epistemically responsible thing for an American citizen to do? Investigate the claims that could antagonize a nuclear-armed power? Or leave uninvestigated the claims that warn our national sovereignty has been compromised? Whose word do you take for it? Those who claim the government doesn't have good evidence that Russia has actively conspired in Trump's favor, or those who claim there is good evidence? How can we know without taking a pitch and risk? The existential anxiety of this situation is only worsened by our technology, as discussed in the Grand Technology by O.G. Rose. And it seems to be the case that the internet and social media have thrown us, to allude to Heidegger, into a world where we have to face and realize the problem of justification, perhaps causing us to suffer more conflict of mind situations than ever before. Under government and powerful institutions, it is likely we will find ourselves in this gray zone of uncertainty often, and it is likely that if there are powerful people who want to control us, it is in their interest to keep us in a place where epistemic responsibility cannot tell us which direction is the right way. though perhaps no one controls us and the powerful are in a gray zone of uncertainty like the one they put us in, for they can do nothing else. Perhaps we are ultimately controlled by the nature of reality. There is no big brother, to use that phrase from later works of O.G. Rose, where epistemic responsibility must conflict with truth because of the ontological structure of reality itself. So perhaps epistemic responsibility must conflict with truth because of the ontological structure of reality itself, but that possibility is almost too heavy to think on. To elaborate, what is the epistemic responsible thing for the media to do when faced with reporting on someone who lies all the time or often? If they don't report on and investigate all of the liar's claims, not only will they be accused of partisanship by those who support the liar, but won't they fail in their commitment to investigate truth? But if they investigate every claim, their time and resources will be sucked up, they'll create continual static, and they won't be able to get to the real stories, perhaps benefiting the liar. However, if they report on the lies, if they report on the lies, don't they risk implying these countless claims are legitimate? Similar questions can be asked of the scientists when faced with the question of debating someone over something that is outlandish, say that the world is flat. But how can the media know which stories are lies without investigating them ahead of time? It should be noted that it is likely that those who think the claims of the liar should be investigated and those who think otherwise will divide along ideological lines. In Self-Delusion and the Towardness of Evidence and the Paradox of Judgment by O.G. Rose, it was argued that we should never say a person is a liar, only that person lied. In other words, we shouldn't judge, only assess. We shouldn't define a person's essence by a person's accidents, which, following Aristotle, the paper argued was a logical fallacy. But if this is so, are we not stuck to investigate every claim a person who always lies makes? And at what point do we know when we've investigated enough? If so, can a manipulative person who wanted to establish a totalitarian regime easily control the people by declaring it epistemically irresponsible to decide that everything he says is a lie without investigation, resulting in the people never standing up to him, caught up in an endless investigation that the dictator could assure remained endless by continually making new claims? We shouldn't judge a person as a liar, but it doesn't follow from this that we cannot make the assessment that a person is more likely to lie than not, or the person will probably lie when he or she speaks. Based on an assessment, we can determine that it is rational, based on probability, for us not to investigate every claim a person makes, but in this situation it should be noted that we could end up acting epistemically irresponsible if the person ends up saying something true. There's no way to escape possibly ending up in a situation where being rational and being epistemically responsible come into conflict. We have to accept the possibility of tragedy or blindly end up forever investigating what is epistemically irresponsible to forever investigate. Democracies that fail to realize or acknowledge this kind of predicament and its possibility are those most likely to end up investigating forever the claims of a person who always lies. All right, all well and good, but at what point is a person justified to assess versus judge that a person will probably lie whenever he or she speaks? And for that matter, when are we justified to assume our assessment about a person is correct? The question of justification still looms. Point 2 of this section. What is the epistemically responsible way to respond to a computer that never lies? If we know everything the computer told us is true, it would seem that investigating every claim of the computer would be epistemically irresponsible. But wouldn't it be a waste of time? We already know ahead of time what our results will be. But if we just accept what the computer said, don't we fail to think for ourselves? In this situation, it would seem that it is epistemically irresponsible to think for ourselves, and yet isn't it epistemically responsible to think for ourselves? As countless graduation speeches have preached, in this situation, isn't it epistemically irresponsible to be epistemically responsible? This situation is similar to the one with the person who lies constantly, and how I approach it should be similar. At what point am I justified to assume that a given computer, or anything for that matter, will never lie or never be wrong? After it has been right 1,000 times, 1,000,000? If I decide 1,000 times, by what standard am I justified to make this decision versus at 1,000,000? Seeing as I must suddenly declare insufficient the very logic by which I decided to make my standard of justification 1,000 versus 100. Wouldn't I be more justified at 1,000,000 versus 1,000? But wouldn't I be more justified at 1,000,000,000 than 1,000,000 ad infinitum, forever and so forth, etc.? I seem to have fallen into a runaway train fallacy, as all questions of justification may end up falling into. If a computer is right 1,000 times, it is perhaps fair to say that I would be rational and reasonable to assume that the computer will always be right, and hence epistemically responsible to not investigate everything the computer claims in order to make sure for myself that the computer is right, and hence think for myself. In this situation, due to a reasonable and rational probability assessment, I find myself in another conflict of the mind. This question is similar to the question of what is the epistemically responsible thing to do if God tells you to build an ark because it's going to rain for 40 days and 40 nights. This question is explored in The Eclipse of Faith and Reason by O.G. Rose. To offer another question, what is the epistemically responsible way to respond to a computer that is wrong only once out of every 1,000 computations? This is the problem similar to the person who doesn't lie all the time, but every now and then, as has already been discussed, we will find ourselves having to choose between being reasonable and epistemically irresponsible and being unreasonable and epistemically responsible, perhaps. A paradox rarely discussed at colleges dedicated to cultivating the life of the mind. The idea of an expert or scholar is to be like a computer that never lies, and arguably this is the hope of the media as well. The ideal is that an expert would be someone who would tell the public something that it would then be epistemically irresponsible for the public not to believe, even without investigating for themselves, which is arguably impossible for an average person to do to the same degree as a professional can. I mean, after all, it's the job of the professional, and the average people have other jobs. In fact, the hope of an expert is to make it so that investigating what the expert says is in fact epistemically irresponsible. To repeat, in fact, the hope of an expert is to make it so that investigating what the expert says is in fact epistemically irresponsible, except perhaps by other experts, as it would be to investigate what a computer claims that never lies, except perhaps by other computers that never lied. Of course, this suggests a risk of manipulation. Arguably, a society that lacks experts like this, who are assumed to be speaking truths far more often than speaking falsities, and who are assumed to never intentionally portray falsities as truths, is a society that lacks a desperately needed group of people. The public simply cannot investigate everything, and yet in a democracy, the public finds itself having to make decisions about nearly everything. We require access to claims that we can trust are true without investigating them ourselves. We must be able to believe that X is true, even though I personally haven't been epistemically responsible regarding X. We require a group who can represent us in being epistemically responsible, a group through who we can be epistemically responsible without being so directly. It's similar to how in a functioning economy we require for other people to do jobs we cannot do. I cannot be a truck driver, a teacher, a pencil maker, a coffee grower. I require others to fill functions I cannot fill, as they require the same of me. And if we don't trust one another to fill these functions, the society will suffer. Likewise, if we don't trust our experts, scholars, and media to be epistemically responsible for us, the society will suffer. All this points to why the legitimization crisis, which Habermas warns about, is so dire. Once we cease to trust our experts, scholars, and media to be epistemically responsible for us, once we all feel we have to be epistemically responsible for ourselves about everything, an impossibility, democracy will suffer. Our capacity to avoid unnecessary pitch and risks will diminish. The likelihood we fall into radical doubt and cynicism will skyrocket, and the likelihood will diminish that we ever return to a day in which we don't suffer from a legitimization crisis. To elaborate, to emphasize a point, if there is no expert class we can trust, we cannot feel robustly epistemically responsible without studying everything, which is impossible. Even if we acknowledge that we cannot study everything without an expert class, we will feel uncomfortable with this truth precisely because we will feel more responsible for our failure to do enough. We will feel responsible for our failure to not do enough. It was argued in On Trust by O.G. Rose that trust is something that must be given until a person has reason to withdraw. Trust cannot be earned. Do note that the question of justification is a question of when are you justified to trust X versus when are you justified to give X a chance to earn your trust. The second is hopeless, as argued in the paper. On Trust, does not argue that we should trust everyone and everything, but it does argue that it should be our default to trust until we have reason not to, and that we shouldn't think of trust as something earned or unearned. We do have reason to withdraw trust from the media, politicians, and so forth. For example, we don't know the people directly who make it up, and on occasion some members of the press and government have attempted intentionally or unintentionally to manipulate and deceive us. But of course, if we require this class, this could be a problem. Point three. What is the epistemically responsible way to approach a conspiracy theory, myth, or the like? If I decide Bigfoot doesn't exist without first looking for Bigfoot, have I acted epistemically irresponsible? But if I begin looking for Bigfoot, at what point of investigation should I slip from being epistemically irresponsible to believe Bigfoot doesn't exist to being epistemically responsible for believing such? After checking 10 mountains? After checking 15? By what standard can I say 10 is enough and not 15? Is there no objective standard? Is it epistemically responsible or epistemically irresponsible to investigate the claims that 9/11 was an inside job? On the topic of investigating conspiracies in general, A, if we say something is epistemically responsible, by what standard do we determine it is one versus another? Keep in mind that people are likely to disagree about which conspiracy theories are plausible and which aren't. B, if we say it's always epistemically responsible, then we have set ourselves up to not only be easily controlled and manipulated by a dictator, leader, or other who will just continually throw conspiracy theories, lies, and so forth our way, but we have also set ourselves up to fall victim to every pitch and risk we come across, as will be discussed. The only way to stand against this would be to face an existential anxiety caused by a feeling of epistemic irresponsibility, which is something by definition we will feel like we shouldn't stand against. C, if we say up to a point is epistemically responsible, then how do we decide when it has ceased being epistemically responsible to investigate a given conspiracy theory? By what standard? When we feel we have gone on long enough? Do emotions carry such authority? If we agree with the work of Daniel Goldman, perhaps they should. But what standard can we say emotions should? Because perhaps emotions have been right for 9 out of 10 times, then in this situation, perhaps we can be rational to follow our emotions, but not necessarily epistemically responsible. And why is 9 out of 10 times good enough versus 19 out of 20? D, if we say it is never epistemically responsible, by what standard can we make this claim, seeing as some conspiracies have turned out to be true, such as Hemingway's claim that the CIA was tracking him? Unless we've investigated every conspiracy claim to know they all lack any truth, we cannot say they are never epistemically responsible to investigate, without in that very act being epistemically irresponsible, though perhaps we act reasonably and or correctly. It would seem that there is no objective standard by which we could establish that it is sometimes, always, up to a point, or never epistemically responsible to investigate a conspiracy theory. It doesn't seem that anything we decide to do would be the right or wrong thing to do. It would just be a choice that was deeply consequential, but it would also perhaps never be possible to say that it was good or bad, a good or bad choice. And keep in mind that the points listed above would also apply to investigating myths and religions. For example, at what point are we epistemically responsible to say Christianity is true or that Christianity is false? And does anyone actually practically come to believe in a religion by this kind of questioning? Or do they just find themselves in it, almost mysteriously? The same could be asked of ideologies in general. Let us pause and meditate a little more on the possibility that it is right to say it is never epistemically responsible to investigate a conspiracy theory. Yes, even if this was true, it wouldn't address the problem of when we are justified to say X is a conspiracy theory versus a theory. Certainly, it would be helpful if we could establish that once we perhaps justly categorize X as a conspiracy theory, we are then justified and epistemically responsible not to investigate it. If we define a conspiracy theory as that which disproving would require taking the pitch and risk, then perhaps I am not only reasonable but also justified to assent to and live by the premise it is never epistemically reasonable to investigate a conspiracy theory. Though I still face the problem of addressing by what standard am I justified to define a conspiracy theory as such, which points to the problem of justification in deciding that X be the signifier for signified Y, though this is admittedly a technical concern more than a practical one. What is the pitch and risk, by the way? A notion inspired by The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon. That is addressed fully in The True Isn't the Rational paper by O.G. Rose. Here I will say that it is to investigate if X is true when there is no guaranteed point in which we'll be able to say for sure that X is true or false. For example, if we begin investigating the question, does God exist? There is no guarantee that if we read every theology book, every religious text, every New Age atheist book against religion, and study the question for 80 years, that in the end we'll be able to say for sure whether or not God exists. To investigate questions about God's existence and God's identity is to take a pitch and risk. A good image for understanding pitch and risks could be found in Abyss, the anime. In the series, there is an abyss that if you enter, there is a curse that makes it hard to come out. At a certain point of depth, it's nearly impossible to climb out without either losing your life or your humanity. Certain characters enter the abyss in hopes of adventure and finding certain goals, and if they accomplish their dreams, then perhaps entering the abyss was worth it, seeing as they might never be able to return home. But if they don't, not only does the quest prove to be a waste, but now they are stuck. And so the deeper they travel, knowing they can't go back, perhaps the more desperate they can become to find evidence that the journey was worth it, that in the end it will all add up. The only way characters could ever know if entering the abyss would be worth it was by entering the abyss and standing outside of the abyss at the top, before any journey ever started. Longing, curiosity, and perhaps even epistemic responsibility aided them. It is not the case that answering any given question requires taking the pitch and risk, but some do, and faced with those questions, would epistemic responsibility have us take the pitch and risk? Is the only way to avoid the pitch and risk to be epistemically immoral and intellectually dishonest? Is the nature of epistemic responsibility to push us into pitch and risks? All of them, I might add. Is epistemic morality so cruel that it would have us enter the abyss? Is that not where Nietzsche warned we could become a monster? If we say that epistemic responsibility doesn't require us to investigate every pitch and risk, by what standard do we make this claim? It would seem by the practical knowledge that a pitch and risk could forever consume us, without any guarantee of successfully determined truth, that we are justified to avoid them, perhaps by that fact alone. Even if there is perhaps truth to be found by taking such risks, perhaps we are justified to avoid pitch and risks because of the practical fact that we cannot know if a pitch and risk is worth taking except by taking it. It's circular. Personally, I think this practical reality is legitimate grounds for avoiding investigating the validity of X if determining its validity requires taking a pitch and risk. But how can we be sure that X actually requires taking that risk versus only appear to require taking that risk? Furthermore, if we agree that a person is justified to avoid pitch and risks, couldn't someone just claim that X is a pitch and risk to avoid investigating it and to avoid being compelled by epistemic responsibility to do so? And to scare people from it and remove epistemic imperative to investigate it, couldn't a leader or dictator claim X is a pitch and risk, aware that if people found out the truth about X, his or her power would be threatened? And wouldn't the above logic mean atheists aren't intellectually obligated to investigate God's existence? Would the above logic mean theists aren't intellectually obligated to investigate God's non-existence? Please note that people naturally absorb their first worldview versus think their way into it, as discussed in Compelling by O.G. Rose. If we accept that we aren't epistemically obligated to investigate pitch and risks, that we are justified to avoid them on practical grounds, then we must also concede that the Christian isn't epistemically obligated to investigate Islam, potentially worsening tribalism in the midst of pluralism. We must leave open a way we could be controlled and manipulated by people in power. We must make it possible for a tyrant to not answer or feel obligated to address critics, and furthermore give ourselves the power to avoid investigating anything we don't want to investigate by claiming it's a pitch and risk, even when it very well might not be, seeing as there is no way to tell what only appears to be a risk versus actually is one without investigating and taking a pitch and risk, perhaps without knowing it. But perhaps this trade-off is better than the thoughtless alternative. Well, that may require pitch and risk to determine. When am I epistemically responsible to claim X is a conspiracy theory versus a theory? Are the allegations against Trump involving Russia a conspiracy theory or a theory? Do note the severity of the claims increases the direness to answer this question quickly. By what standard do I determine X is a conspiracy theory as opposed to a theory? Perhaps a conspiracy theory is a theory that is internally consistent but lacks hard evidence in its favor. While a theory has more hard evidence backing it up, so be it. But does that mean only theories can be true? Not necessarily. 10 days from now, hard evidence could appear, transforming a conspiracy theory into a theory, as if it was always a theory. Is a theory a chain of contingent deductions no longer than 10, while a conspiracy theory is a chain of contingent deductions longer than 10? Does a theory consist of deductions that at least 60% can be falsified, while the majority of deductions that make up a conspiracy theory cannot be falsified? But what standard can we say which? According to what standard of justification? To define X, are we justified to say we are justified to define X as this or that? At what point does a conspiracy theory garner enough evidence to become a theory enough to become a truth? Again, the question of justification lurks. To elaborate, intentionally or unintentionally, a leader or dictator could manipulate, control, confuse, or turn the public cynical by constantly appealing to conspiracy theories that could only maybe be falsified by taking the pitch and risk, lacking a clear objective standard by which a given person could determine if he or she is justified to not investigate the claims of the leader. The public would likely be at a loss to know what to do, especially if the people don't trust their experts or media due to a legitimization crisis, which the leader very well may have caused. Since a given conspiracy theory may only be disproven by taking the pitch and risk, it is possible that the leader who is manipulating the public is also manipulating his or herself without realizing it. The leader may not even realize that the truth claim to which the leader appeals is a conspiracy theory versus a theory or a truth. It is possible in this situation for everyone to be manipulated, including the manipulator, a Kafkaesque emergent result for which everyone and no one is responsible. Epistemic responsibility entails a commitment to resist confirmation bias, the act of which we are constantly engaged in much more than we realize. It can be argued that the common advice for writers to know your audience means know whose confirmation bias you will appeal to. But if this means we must take a pitch and risk, is this necessarily a reasonable thing to do? Perhaps the role of confirmation bias is to help us avoid taking that risk, to existentially stabilize us. If the atheist claims he doesn't want to investigate religion because it is a pitch and risk, we should be understanding. If the theist tells us something similar, we should also extend sympathy. And yet. Point 4. What is the epistemically responsible way to respond to someone who says, what I am saying is a lie? In other words, concerning Gödel, what is the epistemically responsible way to approach a liar's paradox? If what the person is saying is true, it isn't a lie, but if it's a lie, then it is true, a paradox. Hence, if we investigate to determine if the claim is true, we must investigate to determine if it is a lie, which will result in it being a lie. If we investigate to determine if the claim is a lie and determine it is, we determine that the claim is true. In this kind of situation, epistemic responsibility would compel us to lock ourselves into a paradox, and realizing this, it would be reasonable for us not to investigate the claim in the first place. But would this be epistemically responsible? It would be like avoiding a pitch and risk, perhaps. Reasonable, but perhaps epistemically irresponsible. It's hard to say. Perhaps sometimes decisions are just decisions, neither epistemically responsible nor irresponsible. Perhaps accepting that decisions are sometimes just what they are is our only hope to avoid being led into destruction by epistemic responsibility. Perhaps, but according to what standard of justification? And so we face the question. This has been part 2 of The Conflict of Mind by O.G. Rose. For more, please visit ogrose.com. You can find us on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter. All likes and shares are appreciated. And thank you so much for your time.